me just introduce very quickly John Turner, who comes to us from, who is a professor of finance at Queen's University in Belfast. And he is going to present, his paper was Marshall Wright, Managerial Failure and Corporate Ownership in Edwardian Britain. And that paper is co-authored with two of his colleagues at Queen's, Michael Aldous and Philip Flyers.
Thank you very much, Naomi, and thank you also to Henry for organizing this conference. It's been really nice to see so many familiar faces today. My two co-authors are both here and will be helping to answer the questions, I hope. And apologies if I'm somewhat incoherent. It's already been a 12-hour day and it's at 7 p.m. here in Belfast. So really delighted to present this paper. This is its first outing, our first iteration of it. So really delighted to get your feedback. So it was Marshall Wright. Okay, so in his 1919 book, Industry and Trade, Marshall made several claims as follows. He said that the ownership of large British business had separated from control by the 1910s. He suggests that this explains why British companies lacked vigor compared to their US and German counterparts, and that this acted as a drag on national prosperity and productivity. And for Marshall, the solution was for British firms to follow the US examples, where shareholders in power, autocratic, and well and appropriately educated managers. Now, Marshall's view is not the one that has reigned in sort of British economic and business history over the past number of decades. The orthodox view is more around, it's not the separation of ownership and control, it's problems with family ownership. And so the malaise of companies that Marshall was observing, according to people like Chandler and Payne and Wilson and others, it's due to family ownership. It's due to family control of these companies. And indeed, much of then Britain's subsequent economic malaise can be traced back to this failure. Now, this view has been challenged most recently by the likes of James and Les in their work, where they look at the top 330 companies in 1911 and find that there's what they call an extreme divorce of ownership and control. Work that I've done with co-authors looking at the 19th century and after the 1862 Act, Companies Act in particular, we also observed that ownership was relatively separated from control in that period as well. So what do we do in this paper? Well, we look at roughly the top 1,700 public companies in 1911. Roughly, this is about half in terms of market capitalization of companies at the time, and it's roughly just over half in terms of the number of companies as well. And we ask three questions. Was ownership concentrated in the hands of directors? Who were the controllers of these companies? And did ownership and control ultimately matter for firm performance? What we find, just in case I run out of time, we first of all find that ownership was separated from control for most companies. For the vast majority of companies, 75% or thereabouts, ownership and control was separated. There is a subset of firms where there is some major ownership by directors. When we compare the chairmen, and this goes to Mary's question, they all were men. We can compare the chairmen of British companies to those in the US at the time. We see that British chairmen were less well connected via director networks, were less likely to have deep business experience. So social class played a role for British chairmen more than the business experience, and were much less likely to be university educated. So maybe Marshall was right. We also find that ownership wasn't a correlated performance, and we're not that upset by that. It's it's endogenous, and so that's not a problem. What we do observe is tentative evidence at the minute that better performing companies were more likely to have a manager who was university educated and who had multiple directorships in other companies. So again, going to this idea that the companies that had chairmen more like US type chairmen typically performed better. We're not claiming any causal story here. Those two things are just correlated at the minute. So let me say a little bit about the data and then a little bit about the results. So we use this Investors 4-shilling yearbook, and again, this is something that Les has used in his work. This was produced by the Financial Reviews for about 4 years, round about the First World War, the start of the First World War. And in the 1912 version of this yearbook, for the 1,700 odd companies that are in this book, it reports some really interesting information. First of all, it reports the total amount of directors' holdings. So how much of the capital did the directors own? This would have required a lot of work because these company shareholder lists were in various company houses, in London, Edinburgh, and various other places. And so the people who put together this yearbook had to go and calculate that. And they also calculated an estimate of the number of shareholders. And we reckon this is to the closest 100 in most cases. And because this was the Financial Reviews that helped publish this, we also have figures here for net profit and for total assets, which again allow us potentially to look at performance. So this is where we started. We've got roughly, as I say, 1,700 firms from this. You know, one of the firms that I've highlighted here is R&J Dick Limited. They produce leather goods, particularly belts for machinery. And according to this advertisement, they even have a factory in New Jersey. And so if we just look at this one company, what we then did is we went to the Stock Exchange Yearbook for each company, because the Stock Exchange Yearbook tells us here who the chairman of the company is, who if there was a managing director, and the number of shareholders on the company. We also get all other information about the capitalization of the company, debentures, preference shares, ordinary shares, and also the voting schemes of the companies and where the shares would have been traded on which regional UK market. So we add that into our data set. We're particularly interested in the chairman because you know, Marshall's view was that the chairman was the person in control of these companies, and I think Les would agree with that as well. Though we also do look at companies where there is also a managing director. Then our next step, because we're interested not just in the ownership and the separation of ownership control, but we're interested who's actually controlling these companies, particularly if there is a lot of separation, or if there is a separation of ownership and control. So again, thinking of RJ and Dick, we've got an example on the screen. We use this really wonderful biographical dictionary. So Bassett had produced one of these dictionaries in 1900, and unfortunately the only other one he produced was in 1911, and this was looking at businessmen in the UK, and pretty well he had a set of agents around the UK that helped him compile this. So here's the chairman of R&J Dick. It's James Parker. We're told when he was born, we're told his career. So he happened to be an MP for a period of time. He also then was educated both at public school and university, and we then find the other companies where he is a director. And we also see the gentleman clubs that he belonged to. Now, I realize for a US audience, a gentleman's club maybe is something different, but these were elite clubs where people got together and, you know, when they visited London or visited other cities, where they met with people of like mind. And then, because we're interested in performance, you know, thinking of you know, how we're going to measure, you know, performance, or Tobin's Q is one of the things we're after. So again, we collected stock prices from the Investors Monthly Manual. Doesn't exist, you know, for all of the companies that are sampled, but we collected what we could. And then we're also interested in the ultimate fate of these companies. What happened to them? How long did they survive for? And why did they disappear? Just as another measure of performance. So very briefly, let me go through our results. So here's our sample. We have here the director ownership. It exists for 1,548 of the companies. And so for the average company, the directors of the company own 17% of the company or thereabouts. And the average company had 5 to 6 directors. The median company, the ownership's 8.9%. And there are a bunch of companies, as you can see here, when we look at, you know, the percentage of directors that had more than 1/3 of the ownership, or more than 1/2 the ownership. You know, there's a subset of firms 17% where the directors had more than 1/3, 8% where they had more than 1/2 of the company. So ownership is separate from control for the vast majority of companies. We're also interested here in family firms, and one of the difficulties is trying to figure out, well, what is a family firm? And so the way that we have defined this is if one of the directors' names is in the company name, then that is that constitutes a family firm. And so 24% or 25% of our firms meet that sort of definition of a family firm. And so we have quite a few family firms in amongst all of these as well. In terms then of number of shareholders, it's really skewed because you've got a lot of really large shareholders, a bit like Eric's example, a lot of really large shareholders in some of these really top companies, and then the rest of the companies typically have lots lower numbers of shareholders. We could look at this by industry. Railways, utilities have got very low levels of director ownership. Things like engineering, breweries, paper printing companies typically have a lot more. That's not surprising. The one surprise I think that you might see here is banks and insurance companies, which have been around for decades, and typically we would think of them having diffuse ownership. The issue here is banks and insurance companies tended to have really large boards of directors. It was usual for these companies to have 20 directors, and so that's what driving a lot of that high number there. We look at covariates of ownership. Family firms have very strong covariate, and in the paper we discuss some of the other covariates. So family firms typically have a lot higher ownership by directors. So what about the controllers? So we've got quite a substantial number of firms where there is a separation of ownership and control. So who's actually controlling these firms? What type of individuals are they? So we look here in just this table at the chairman of these companies. We were able to get information on about 805 chairmen out of our sample. We've checked that the firms that we weren't able to get the information on, or the Bassett didn't report on, that there's no bias there, and there doesn't seem to be a bias. But you get the idea that the average age 61, the average number of other directorships they have is 3.5. Vast majority of the club members, quite a large percentage, 21% had been or were MPs. 17% had been to an elite public school, and you can see then in terms of their professional background where they had come from, but a low number had university education. When we look at the business background of our chairman, what we tend to see is that the companies with the most diffuse ownership, or the greatest separation of ownership and control, typically had you might say a chairman who had lots of other directorships and who typically had a business background. And when we look at firm size, again, larger firms typically had a chairman who had multiple directorships. And again, that sort of comes out in here between the difference between family and non-family firms. When you think of social status, again, we're thinking here of, we're trying to sort of run a horse race in some sense between social status and deep business experience. And so we tend to find that firms with the greatest separation of ownership and control, more likely to be peers of the realm, more likely to be MPs, more likely to have been a military officer, more likely to have gone to an elite public school, more likely to have gone to Oxbridge or to an elite university. And the same is true for larger firms and for the chairman of those. And family firms, again, typically you don't see these elite, socially elite individuals being the chairman of family firms. Okay, so how does this compare with the United States? And again, if people could point us to really good sources here, we really appreciate it. There's a few studies that have been done looking at CEOs or chairman or presidents in the United States, Newcomer and Miller. So Newcomer really highlights this idea that about university education. 39% of her sample are university educated versus 23% in ours. Miller talks about these multiple directorships that these chairmen had, which is really high, 16 versus 4.4 for us, and that CEOs typically came from elite business families in the United States, whereas for us they come from political or aristocratic elite as well as the business elite. Finally, performance. I know I'm quickly running out of time here, but what we find here, the relationship between director ownership and performance, we don't find very much. Is the bottom line, and we're okay with that. It's a damp sits and land type story. It's all endogenous. In terms of our chairman characteristics, return on assets is one of the variables we use for performance. Elite public schools have this detrimental effect on return on assets. There's this long-standing debate about the usefulness of elite public schools in Britain. They teach a lot of the classics, but they don't, and they train young men to be gentlemen, but they don't give them very much else, and particularly that they don't help them become good business leaders. However, when we look at Tobin's Q as a measure of performance, it's probably a much better measure of performance. Some things do stand out here. The number of other directorships has a positive relationship with Tobin's Q. So the more directorships a chairman has, the better performing the company. The same is true with their university education, with public school education, and with an Oxbridge degree. Those things tend to result in better performance. So finally, conclusion, was Marshall right? Well, we think he was right in that ownership was separate from control for the vast majority of companies. Did ownership matter for performance, which is what he suggested? We don't find very much evidence of that. Were chairmen different to their US peers? Yes, it seems they were. They were less likely to be university educated. They were less likely to come from the business elite, and they had fewer directorships. And so really the future research agenda for us, and this is part of a larger project, looking at the rise of the CEO in the UK, or the chairman in the UK, and trying to figure out who were they, where did they come from, and how did they get there. So thank you very much for listening. I'm sorry I've run over by a couple of minutes, but that's me.
So we have a large queue. And you can see the order of much of it on the screen, but the first person is Brian Sheffens.
Yeah, so that was expected, a very intriguing paper, John. That was very interesting. One point here is that you're saying that this is, you're assuming that you have totally reliable ownership data from what you're actually looking at is a source that focuses in on directors, where there was no legal compulsion, no legal disclosure requirements here. It was all down to the due diligence of the editors of the Schilling's Yearbook. And I went back and looked at Les' paper with James Foreman Peck, and they described in considerable detail sort of the qualifications that one needs to make when using the source. And that was for 337 companies, and you're going for a considerably deeper dive. I'm interested to hear what Les has to say about, perhaps some of the qualifications. The one point about women is that, going back and looking at Les's paper, women were never directors. That didn't mean they'd ever own shares. So it's conceivable that they were, particularly in families, that the ownership was considerably greater than what would be indicated from simple director ownership. And that's particularly salient when you look at the various industries that were at the bottom of your table, which indicated industry types. So like the past was near the top, railways, those kind of companies. The bottom, the industrial future of Britain, was where the director ownership was. So in the most important companies, arguably for Britain, as it went through the 20th century, ownership may well not have been nearly as separated as you're implying. And tying into that is that when I looked at the very largest companies around the same time, dominant ownership or substantial shareholders were really pretty common. It's really kind of strange. It was the smaller companies that were different. Very final point is that Florence in 1936, when he looked at industrial companies, he found pretty substantial ownership. What changed? Like, what was the difference between 1911 and 1936? Did ownership reconcentrate, and why? Okay, that's a lot of points, but I'll stop now.
Yeah, thank you, Brian. Yeah, so in terms of how trustworthy the underlying data is, part of me wants to say it's what we've got. But I think we can do better than that, because I think we could cross-reference this with a few companies where we've been able to get their actual the Form E from Companies House, so we can actually begin to cross-reference as to whether the yearbook is accurate or not, because this would have been a very expensive operation for the financial review reviews to actually compile this yearbook. So I think that's a really good point, and I think we can do that for a very small subset. I think I really take on board your point about women shareholders, because you're right, they would have been substantial shareholders, and they may have been the wives of the directors, and so therefore, you know, one has to ask the question as to whether then they really independently own those shares, etc., etc. So that's something that's not going to be in that figure, and I don't know that it's very much that we can do about it apart from check a small subsample. I think you're also right about large owners, because you may well have had large owners who weren't directors. Now, the work that I've done looking, you know, from 1862 through to 1900, we didn't find many examples of really large shareholders who weren't also directors. There were one or two, but not that many. And indeed, then the question, you know, why does ownership become concentrated? I think part of the story is that there are concentrated ownership firms in here, and they're mainly in the industrial sector to some extent. And really what happens is that the number of companies which have diffuse ownership disappear, so the railways disappear, a lot of utilities disappear, you know, they're privatized, the banks, insurance companies amalgamate and merge, and so there's a reduced number of companies then that have this diffuse ownership. So I think they're there. I just think that they become more prominent in the sort of in the investor world. The companies that people are investing in now are the companies that are at the sort of the upper quartile in our sample. I think that's part of the answer. I'm not sure it's the full answer, but I think that's part of it. Indeed, Les is here, and he may have another view on that.
Yeah, that's great. That final point, yeah, I tend to agree. I think that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, thank you, Brian.
Les.
Let me just say, this is really leading edge stuff. I mean, we have here a bigger sample than anyone else has ever used. We have a range of information, which, despite Brian's qualifications, which are absolutely right, you know, is fantastically full. And this is all down to a guy called Herbert Bassett, who, you know, before the First World War, did pretty well single-handed what the Temporary National Economic Committee did in the US in the 1930s. This is all very impressive stuff. But in my usual way, I'm going to say what's wrong with this paper. So I think it's the US comparisons which are wrong. And in some ways, they're very odd, because he's explicitly saying the British were uneducated bozos who didn't go to university. Well, all the literature says this. But actually, if you look at John's data, it says the opposite. I mean, his difference is quite small between the percentage of chairmen and directors who had university degrees in Britain and America. What is it? 39% versus
23
something percent. But if you actually look at the US sources, which are Newcomer and Miller, their source, they're actually looking at a very tiny portion. They're looking at 214 rather than 1,700 firms in the case of Newcomer, and 174 versus 1,700 and you know, they're biased towards large firms. The smallest firm in Newcomer is £5 million assets, and the smallest firm in Miller is £9 million assets, and most of yours are massively below that.
Yeah.
And so, you know, maybe larger firms are more likely to have university people And you really haven't allowed for that. And there's the same problem with your Central American comparison, which is American directors were better networked. The source of Newcomer and Miller for that is the Directory of Directors for New York for this period. If you look at the Directory of Directors for New York, a large number of the directorships are in, they have 3 United Steel directors, and United Steel directors were directors of numerous subsidiaries which United Steel had. They were also directors of the Metropolitan Opera and the Knickerbocker Club. And you don't count those in Britain. Now, I suspect you might still find the same if you correct for all this, but I think you need to do quite a lot more work to do so.
Yes. So the comparisons with the US, I suppose we were rather tickled by the fact that Marshall made these comparisons, and that's why we're trying to make them. And you're right in terms
Very tempting.
Yeah, the samples of Miller and Newcomer are very small. But even when we zone in terms of the firms that you would have looked at, Les, so the sort of the top quartile in terms of assets or in terms of capitalization, we're still finding a bit of a gap between what
but
the
the
US
top quartile were much bigger, much smaller than £9 million and £5 million assets, which is what Newcomer and Miller are looking at. You don't need to look at the top quartile. You need to look at firms with the same size.
Yes, yeah.
Right. So the next 3 are Chris McKenna, Amanda Gregg, and Marco Brent.
Okay, so mine just follows on Les. I should have expected that he would notice this right away, but I think that the comparison that you're using in terms of university graduates would be naturally skewed by the fact that Americans were much more likely to go to university at that time. And I've tried to look this up, and I can't quite get the numbers, but it suggests to me that more than 60% of Americans at that time were currently involved in post-18-year-old education of some form. So there were all kinds of correspondence schools and whatever, but I don't think there's anything like that number in the UK at that point. And so the fact that you're looking at 24, 25%, that might be very close to, it might be over the national average very easily. Whereas the fact that 40% of them have had some sort of university degree is actually under the average rate of white males at that time, from what I can work out. So I think you're going to have to do that kind of calculation across the board when you look at the likelihood of various sorts of things, if that makes sense.
Yeah, thank you, Chris. Yeah, so it's there's such a large difference between the US and the UK at this time in terms of the percentage of the population that went to universities and the number of universities. And so, yeah, I suppose if we correct for that, then it doesn't look as bad in the UK. In terms
I think it looks extraordinary, actually.
Yeah.
Amanda.
I have 2 comparatively microscopic questions. The first is, I'd be really curious to know if you have examined the distribution of the management and chairman characteristics by industry. I see that industry is controlled for in the regressions, but it occurs to me that in some industries, technical expertise may be more valuable than in others. So you may consider split sample regressions for some of your results. Maybe you've done that already and you can tell us what they show. And a second relatively small question is, in noticing the difference in the results you have for return on assets versus Tobin's Q, I think in your presentation you remarked that just Tobin's Q is probably a better measure, it's just a market value, which seems sensible to me, but I'm wondering if that's the whole story, or if you thought of any other hypotheses for why those results are different. Thanks. And I love the paper. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Amanda. Yeah, we again, because this is an early version, but we have looked at by industry, but we haven't done anything in terms of the econometrics, by industry, in terms of whether there's a difference across, with chairman characteristics. So that's something, that we should do. In terms of return on assets, there's probably someone in the audience who's listening on who emailed me earlier today to to say, well, really, accounting historians don't trust profit figures in this period. And I think I probably would agree with that. And so that's why I would put a lot less weight on the return on assets figure. I'm not entirely sure that we can trust, the profit data. It was an unregulated environment. So that's why I think why we're seeing those different sets of results. But again, we haven't really done enough to this yet. We've only really got sort of univariates with then a bunch of control variables in. So we possibly have a bit more work to do there. And one of the solutions with return on assets is to actually look at some sort of average over a time period, and we might get different results if we did that. I don't know if that fully answers your question, but those are the things that we've been thinking about. I don't know if either of my co-authors want to come in on that.
So yeah, maybe I can briefly elaborate on that. So I completely agree that return on assets figures and accounting figures in that period can be highly biased. Earnings management, there's no regulations whatsoever going on. So I would suggest, like John did, we focus more on either on Tobin's Q, or we collect additional data to sort of smooth out any sort of earnings management that might be going on. Now, when it comes to Amanda, comes to your comment about the industry variation. Now, all of our analysis do include industry fixed effects, but I do take your point that different manager characteristics might be more important in certain industries. At the same time, you want to be very careful, because this is not a panel analysis. This is really an analysis in 1912, 1911, that you're not going to end up looking at very small groups. So you have to be very careful which industries you're looking at, and the number of companies that you're looking at in those analyses. So there's a couple of problems for us to think about there, but nothing that we couldn't do.
Thank you. So now we'll go to Marco, and then Ron and Eric.
Yeah, John, thank you. I mean, it was really a fascinating paper. So I had a very simple question. I have a very simple question, which is, who was actually managing these firms? I mean, you go for the chairman. Now, fast forwarding in the US, we know that Sloan was a president, so he ran a presidential system. Maybe these lords and sirs were actually very good at cracking the whip.
Yeah, so this is actually part of the wider project, is trying to figure out who actually had executive control, who was pulling the levers, who was making the strategic decisions, and when do we see a switch to the autocratic president or the CEO in the UK? So in our sample, we were able to see that quite a large number of these firms have a chairman who is typically early 60s and a managing director who is typically in early 50s. And so for us now, we want to trace this out and figure out whether then those people who are managing directors become chairman, and then how that whole system changes and evolves. But the best that we can tell, that in the sample that we have, it's the chairman who is pretty much calling the shots in most of these companies. There's one or two where it's they actually don't have a chairman, and it was kind of great to see these where it's governance by committee. But we're talking 3 or 4 companies out of the 1,700 that we looked at that have that sort of structure.
Ron?
Very interesting project, highly useful for my needs. Thanks for doing this hard labor for our community of historians of the corporation. My question is whether, in addition to trying to kind of analyze things based on sectors or industries or based on family firms, as you classify them by name. Could you maybe, I know that it's hard to kind of gather this information, but I saw it on the 4 shillings slide that you showed us, whether this corporation was born as a corporation or was born as a partnership or a family firm that down the stream was turned into a corporation. Because for the latter, it's quite clear that there was a controller in place before the transformation, and maybe over time things have changed. Whereas for the former, you know that you had to construct a board from the start, you needed some famous figures on the board for various reasons, etc. And when I looked at your example of Dick, Dick, if I was able to read the small letters correctly, was probably not classified as a family firm. But on the other hand, it did mention that it was some sort of a partnership that was transformed into a corporation. And my suspicion is that you'll find different stories for these 2 subgroups of your general population.
Yeah, and thank you, Ron. That's a really good suggestion. Yes, so in the case of R&J Dick, so the company had been in essence set up by the Dicks and was a partnership, but it seems that then they basically sold out and cashed out and retired, I think was the background to that. But what we have recorded is the way in which these companies were incorporated and when they were incorporated. And that gives us some clue, I think. So if they incorporated under the 62 Act, or if they incorporated under earlier acts, we do have that observation. We do know that, and we know when they incorporated as well. And we know that in certain industries, so the brewery industry is a famous example, they pretty much all had been partnerships. Iron and steel is another example. You know, they all had been partnerships and then converted into that. But I think we could potentially do a little bit better than that by, you know, really digging into the backgrounds of these companies and figuring out where they came from. So if the yearbook gives us enough information on that, we could do that. But that's a you know, a really good suggestion.
Eric.
So it's a wonderful paper, and I want to express my profound envy of the quality of the sources that you have relative to what we have access to in the United States. I just have a minor suggestion that I think might shed some light on one of the correlations I thought was interesting. So among the chairman characteristics that seem to correlate with firm value is the number of other directorships they hold. I thought it'd be interesting, you know, to the extent that you've mostly categorized firms by industry here, whether you could see whether if they're holding directorships among their competitors, whether that's where the value effect is coming from, or rather is it just, you know, holding a number of directorships, creating prestige or something like that, or a sign of being well connected. So if it's among their competitors, then presumably there could be some collusion or suppression of competition there. It'd be nice to kind of shed light on that.
Yeah, thank you, Eric. Yeah, that's a really good suggestion, because we know who their other directorships are. We do observe that, and so we can see whether or not they're in the same industry. I suspect that the vast majority of them are not in the same industry, but we could easily do that and see whether, as you say, whether it's some sort of cartel, stroke monopoly type thing going on, or if it's just they're better networked. And one of the things we have been thinking about is in terms of whether they're networked into sort of the financial companies, particularly into banks. That may shed some light onto why that's valuable. But you know, thank you.
This paper is motivated by questions about the literature on Britain's relative economic decline. And you've told us, I mean, I feel like we've learned an enormous amount already from this exercise in which you're engaged, but I'm not sure that a cross-sectional analysis of performance within Britain really gets to the question of Britain's relative economic decline. But I think you're just some sharper hypothesis testing along the lines that Amanda was suggesting might really be very useful for that purpose. So the literature is often about Britain's failure to adopt certain cutting edge technologies, which you know, may or may not be true, right? Les has poo-pooed some of this very successfully, but by looking at those industries, right, which have been the focus of the literature, and looking at whether they're family-owned enterprises or whether they have university-led management, I think that would allow you to get at these issues in a more direct way.
Yeah, so again, so part of the wider project on this is that we're looking at the CEOs or the chairman of the top 100 companies in the UK from 1800 through the present day.
Yeah.
And so this is part of a deeper dive as a part of that project. So you're totally right that a cross section is not really going to give us very much on this. Whereas if we can look at this, the dynamic and how this changes over time, that's going to tell us a lot more about you know, relative economic decline and why, and the wherefores of this. So this project's ongoing, and we're busy collecting biographical information on the top 100 companies and performance data. And so maybe in a couple of years' time, we will have an answer on that one, Naomi. But yeah, totally right in terms of just that dynamic. Maybe if to come back to Mary's point about, you know, where were the women in terms of these companies? Certainly the work I've done would suggest that by 1911, you know, nearly 50% of the vast majority of companies would have been made up of female shareholders, but female directors were extremely rare. I pulled out one example, I think from 1914, where there was in the UK one female director across all listed companies, and that was the Swansea and Mumbles Railway Company, and her father happened to be the chairman of the company. And the Financial Times at the time commented that the Post is not likely to tax Miss Jenkins' abilities unduly, because the railway was actually leased to another company, so there actually wasn't any management to be done. And so I actually have a grad student at the minute, and this is what she's trying to figure out. When do we start seeing female directors in the UK, and when? And it's remarkable, even looking at shareholder lists in this period. So shareholder lists would have put an asterisk beside shareholders who had enough shares to qualify to be a director. And there's many women who qualified to be a director in terms of the shareholding qualification, but they didn't have an asterisk beside their name. And that's
really interesting.
Yeah, that is really interesting. So it's suggesting that, you know, even though they qualified legally and everything else, socially, it was deemed that women weren't suitable to be directors. So yeah, that's something that again, if you come back to me in a couple of years' time, we might have a bit more of an answer on that one.
And now for the last question, we'll turn to Henry Hansen.
Okay, let me add my compliments to this paper. I think it's a good paper, terrific paper, like all the papers we've had today. And this is an unusually rich cornucopia we've been offered here. I'm going to repeat, I think, Naomi's question about, it's raised by this paper, though I think the paper goes far beyond it. That's the question of endogeneity, really, in the results. One wonders, for example, if one finds a correlation between having an Oxbridge degree and having a profitable company. If somebody with an Oxbridge degree thinks it's a little infra-dig to work for a living, to be a director or a manager at a large company, and consequently we know it's now he, will take such a position only in a very, very prosperous company. And so you would find Oxbridge graduates work for profitable companies, and of course you might easily be misled by the causality there. I'm concerned by a broader question of endogeneity too, which I think the data here are less subject to, but that is cross-sectional searches for correlations with profitability have the difficulty that everything is out of equilibrium. If it weren't out of equilibrium, you wouldn't get any results. That is, if there's a feature such as a board less than 10 people in size that's important for firms, then I take it that we would have firms that have 8 board members and firms that have 12 board members that are on the opposite sides of this divide. But you might find them both have the same rate of return because the competition has driven people, investors out of the inefficient firm and into the efficient firm. So that the capital markets are always working against you here in terms of being able to draw any conclusions out of this. Now, there's a lot of stickiness in these relationships, I suppose, but one feels a little nervous being relying upon stickiness to, especially when you don't know what that stickiness is, to interpret your results. So, so I guess the general question is, how far can you go without running into these endogeneity problems to a serious degree?
Yeah, thank you, Henry. Yeah, we're fully in agreement with you here in terms of, you know, I don't know that we've got a causal story at all here. So again, it sort of goes back to my answer to Naomi's question. So this is part of a larger project where we've got this subset of firms that we're looking at, and we're able to see the sort of dynamic features of it. And so we're able to see whether Oxford graduates are indeed self-selecting into you know, more profitable firms, and et cetera. Whereas in the cross section, we of course can't observe that. You're right also about, you know, can we really rely on you know, what capital markets are telling us about these firms? Again, one of the things that we sort of latch onto, and I think there's a question on this in one of the earlier papers today, it's this idea of failure, of almost like a Darwinian type thing. So do firms with certain characteristics fail, or do they succeed, or are they around for a long period of time? And we probably would want to put more weight on that to try and tease out this sort of causal story. You know, the fact that firms survive tells you something about their fitness, et cetera, rather than relying on capital market data to tell us that. So yeah, it's part of this longer project where there's a dynamic that we're going to be looking at, rather than just this 1 year snapshot.
So thank you very much. So we've had 5 papers today and have had extensive discussions of each of them. And we've covered a good part of the world in a relatively concentrated time period. And now it's time to think about what this all means, what we can get out of considering all these papers at the same time as telling us something about a common phenomenon. All right, see you shortly.